welcome to another exciting edition of Scuttlebutt, the official podcast of the National Museum of the Surface Navy, coming to you from the Associated Foundations Training Center aboard Battleship Iowa in the Port of Los Angeles. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what makes the organization tick, what we like to call the ethos. I'm joined in the studio today by...
Mike Getcher, nuts and bolts, I guess, chief engineer, chief operating officer, all kinds of stuff like that.
Marian Fengler, producer, and apparently a loss for words at the moment. Go ahead, Kyle.
Kyle Aubie, the development manager here and animal caretaker.
Cat manager.
Cat manager. My name's David Campfield. I'm the Chief Information Officer and Vice President with the institution, which I'm not supposed to say institution anymore. I guess I'm supposed to call it organization or company or something.
We're all a little crazy, so.
We're all kind of institutionalized, but...
Before we start, I have a question. What is the etymology of scuttlebutt? Have there been butts scuttled somewhere in the history of the world? I mean, kind of a semi-serious and kind of funny conversation.
It's actually it's a great question, and honestly, the question fits very well in the company ethos because this is what we do: is sit around and contemplate stuff like that. I honestly don't know. When I made chief, we were assigned to research certain things like what is the Charlie Noble and why did it get its name. And for those that don't know, the Charlie Noble is the galley smokestack.
Yep.
And honestly, I have no idea why it's the Charlie Noble, and I have no idea why it's Scuttlebutt.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out. I mean, there's fun things, just names of things. The zoo on the forecastle, for example, is a great one. Mm-hmm. You know, pelican hook and so forth. But turtleback was something most people wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
But,
did you know Don't Sweat the Small Stuff actually has its beginnings on square riggers?
Yeah,
absolutely.
There's a lot of...
Because sweating line.
Yeah.
And you don't
like
sweat the small stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a whole world of etymology we can explore someday, too, because a lot of things originate in the maritime world.
Well, as I like to say about the U.S. Navy, and it's really true of the maritime world at large, 250 years of tradition, unhampered by progress.
There you go. So I think the ethos question was something that came up here recently. As most of you should know, we are working on the design for the National Museum of the Surface Navy. And as part of that, the plan is to, in fact, open up an area of the ship down on what we call second deck. And real quickly, main deck is the main deck as you would imagine it to be. And then in our system here on the Navy, the modern Navy vessels, second deck is the next one below, third deck, fourth deck, all the way down to seventh deck in our case. So on second deck, one deck below main deck, we have a huge area of berthing, spelled B-E-R-T-H-I-N-G, and it is a funny statement, but
speaking
trust
of etymology,
lots of snoring happens there.
Yeah, but and we had realized, a number of years ago that certainly these are areas that are really not useful from a museum perspective. How many bunks can you show people before they're bored to tears? But there's also a lot of history inside that space. So we need this space for the National Museum. It's a very approachable discussion for us to actually build out the spaces into a museum space. And so that's what we've started to do. And in doing so, we have to sit down and talk with our designers, a big company called Applied Minds with a background both in Disney and industrial and any number of things, an amazing company. And we had to share with them a combination of our culture and our ethos about how we preserve things aboard the ship. And we do have an ethos, and it hadn't been articulated terribly well. Shortest version might be that, if we have a unique space aboard the ship, such as the FDR room or Combat Engagement Center, or some place aboard the ship where there's only one of them, that's considered, if you will, sacred, or we don't touch that. We want to preserve that in the state that it was in when we received the ship. On the other hand, if you have areas aboard the ship that are just duplicates, in many cases, many, many, many duplicates, how much value do we have as an institute or as a museum to keep that? Sorry about the institution.
Well, catch there.
But it's ingrained. So, but I have been institutionalized.
Actually.
Yes. But anyways, how do you do that? And we need to share that with people because we want to preserve as much of the ship as we can. But there's this practical need to actually make it functional, and that's the hard part. There's some balance there. And frankly, as I look back in my history, and I'm not going to pick on any particular organization. Good catch again. But I walked aboard other vessels 20 or 30 years ago and found that whole sections had been either gutted. In fact, one of the ships I'm thinking of, one very close to my heart, the Admiral's stateroom, where Halsey had stood, was in fact gutted by an earlier group, from back in the 60s. The owners of the vessel at the time, or the managers of the vessel, had done that. Or they had also done some of the gutting of spaces just from a practical point of view. Oh, gee, it's easier to maintain because we don't have anything on the bulkheads. And that offends us too.
It's quite common, actually. The captain's cabin on another dreadnought-like vessel was converted into an office, and you stop and you're like, this is a unique space. When we opened the museum a decade ago, we had 2 mess decks that were identical. We turned one of those into museum space. We had 2 sculleries from the enlisted mess that were identical. We took one of them out to provide space for the ship's store, and we preserved the other one. And I think that that's really important to say. We have kind of one of everything, but we don't need more than one of everything necessarily.
Yeah, and space is at a premium. You think of the ship, and it's 400,000 square feet. Most people don't even know that. 19 decks sounds huge, but boy, is it impractical.
Oh, yeah.
It's just really awkward to get into spaces. Once you get below 3rd deck, it's essentially all vertical ladders.
And it's a lot of machinery. Yeah. A lot of people are like, whoa, we should have used the Iowa class as command and control vessels instead of Blue Ridge and Mount Whitney. And I'm like, yeah, they're life support systems for a 16-inch 50 caliber. There's not a lot of office space on here.
Yeah, and you think about, this is what I usually say, the ship was designed literally to be in a gunfight. It just has big armor, big guns, and the stuff to support that. And so it's not really conducive to office space, museum space, stuff like that. So we're always trying to work within some of those confines and while preserving the vessel. Same thing is true even when I work on opening up an office space. I'm trying to keep the original stuff. We even keep drawings of how, for example, my office is the old, I call it the HR room. It's the
personnel office.
Yeah, and originally before that, though, by the way, and this is something you can speak to about ships being modified all the time, that was the executive officer's office.
Absolutely.
Really?
And it's
from World War II.
It's funny because, and I'll broach the subject here. We have people that come out and go, oh, we need to return the ship to the World War II configuration. Well, gosh, as a 1980s Iowa sailor, thank you for just dismissing all of what myself and my shipmates did in the Cold War aboard the vessel. Ships are living, breathing things, and it's funny because Mike, you and I have actually, I wouldn't say cross sabers, but had to have some discussions over the fact that I'm used to ships being modified. I want a bracket here. We're just going to weld it to a wall. I want to paint this. I want to drill a hole here, and suddenly the battleship is the artifact, and you're like, ooh. I can't just modify it. But certainly during her commissioning, that was absolutely done. Right. It was, when you needed something done, you did it.
Yeah, vessels literally were modified the day after they were commissioned. They're from that moment on.
Living, breathing entities,
right.
and they evolve over time. And realistically, we have to evolve also. And I talk a lot with my shipmates about, oh, you tore my rack out. You destroyed my office, whatever it was. And I'm reminded of a World War II vet I brought on board when we were in Richmond before we made it to LA. And he was a great guy. And he said, can I go find my berthing? And I said, it's changed a lot since World War II. And he said, no, I really want to go down and see it. So I took him down and we went forward to turret 1 on the 2nd deck, and he found the head. And he's like, well, there's the head and here's the turret. So this must have been the space. He truly did not recognize it. And so we walked around and talked and gave him the cook's tour, and he had a great time. And as we were leaving, I said, thank you, really appreciate it. Did you have a good time? And he kind of looked at me with a tear in his eye, and he said, I really appreciate the hospitality. I wish I had never come, because I can now no longer remember it as it was. I will always see it as it is. Yeah. And that's a really poignant moment. But at the same time, we couldn't have done what we did in the 80s without those modifications. And realistically, we can't do what we need to do as a museum without doing further modification.
Yeah. When I took my dad back, the 50th reunion of his ship, the Massachusetts, and he wandered around, and so much of that has been gutted, frankly. It just from 1960s ethos that they had at the time. Most of the berthing is gone, and he couldn't even recognize some of those issues. It didn't seem to shatter, some of his memories, but certainly it was not the same experience. It was not what he figured he might see.
So I think it's really important, just to sort of underscore how we feel about it as caretakers. I mean, obviously I have a different view of the ship, I think, than my current shipmates. nominally just because I lived here for a real formative period of my life. I tell people the years between age 17 and age 19 are a lot longer. Those 2.5 years on board here are a lot longer than the decade I've actually been working for the organization. But, it kind of hurts just a teeny bit every time you take a torch or a drill or do some modification. But at the same time, you're like, we can advance to be the National Museum of the Surface Navy, tell the story of the entire Navy, really be relevant and draw that thread connecting the past to the future. I know you have a son in the Navy. I have several children in the Navy.
Practically your entire family's in the Navy.
This is
Two more to go and you're done.
This is accurate. So several, 3, and the other one that would be in if he were old enough to sign the contract. But it is something that we need to do because I want to tell their story. I want them to have an organization that tells their story. I want the future. I want their children to have an organization. And this is the quintessential centerpiece for a national museum. And we can tell that story, or we can just appeal to people like me. I'm one of the youngest battleship sailors I know. Thank you, Ernie Reese. You are the other one, 4 or 5 months younger than me. Just a shout out there. But if you only tailor to the battleship sailors, when I'm gone,
Yeah.
What do you have?
you pack up your tent and go home.
There's
And
two. Go ahead.
It's hard, I think, for all of us too, because I walk into the spaces with the bunks not there, and I kind of go, oh,
Yeah. It's
And
difficult.
I tried to talk him into the idea of making a map of the floor plan
You
with the way the
succeeded.
bunks, yeah, so that it somehow gets incorporated into the museum, the map of where all the bunks
Like a
were
witness
in the
mark.
space.
That's a concept of a witness mark. We actually did that. There was modifications done to the berthing that I stayed in. And you want to do something like, when you tear out a bunk, you don't want to match the tile. You want to intentionally use a different type
Yeah.
of tile to say something else was here.
Yeah.
We did that down in Lost at Sea. One thing that we do here, I think we do it well, is that when we do modify things, we try to make it look like it would have been that way in service. So, for example, even back aft in the CPO area for the Veterans Program, which we'll talk about here soon, we bought legitimate Navy doors. One thing that most people wouldn't know is that Navy doors have not changed for probably 50 years. Yeah, pretty much. Literally, the companies make about the same door, and so you can drop in a door. It's a little expensive, $1,800 as I recall. Or, for example, on our heads, our bathrooms up on the main deck, rather than do what I call a Home Depot door, which I've seen on ships, we bought a legitimate flat bottom, 3 foot wide for wheelchair access door that looks legit. It's a real Navy door by a real Navy vendor. Same thing is true for our wheelchair access. We didn't need to hide them. We just placed them in such a way that we're able to get people in while retaining the appearance of the ship. So appearance and how it feels aboard the ship is really important to us. But then speaking to the preservation of the organization, institution, company, whatever you want to call it, really long term, the National Museum is a much bigger effort. We have a much broader base of donation and fundraising. Kyle, I want you to speak to this a little bit because, sometimes people think of nonprofits as being, the word making money for a nonprofit is dirty. It's a dirty word. It's not true. Nonprofit status, as I keep hearing, and I think it's a great phrase, that's a tax position, not a business plan.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think from our perspective, we have this incredible vessel that we are preserving. We have the history inside of it and outside of it, and we want to make sure that is our artifact number one, as we call it. That's the thing that people are here to experience and be immersed within. But from the funder's perspective, and I'm talking about the, I guess, major sponsors, foundations, things like that, maybe not necessarily the individuals that come here and experience it. They want to see community impact. They want to see advancement. They want to see progress in what you're doing, and you are making a positive difference to the broader community. And I think that if we don't continue to make some of these modifications and advance what we're trying to do and push our mission forward, that's when you stop losing interest from those people who are saying, how are we making this a better place to be?
Yeah, we know that we have people who love battleships. We already have their attention. But long term, the company, the organization, once again, the institution, whatever you want to call it, really needs to have that really broad base of support. And it's community based. It's across the nation now for us. It's not just gee, a bunch of battleship sailors who want to donate a few bucks and come by once in a while. This is a much bigger business, a much bigger issue that we need to address.
Right.
When we talk about, what our 3 pillars are, we have a community pillar, which obviously reaches out. We have a sobriety meeting that we had just last night that's part of our community outreach. We have a veterans pillar, which I want to come back to in a second. And we have the education pillar, which includes both educating youth and the museum itself educating the public. We can't do those missions without adapting the vessel to serve that mission. The battleship was built to get in a fist fight with another ship on the high seas. She didn't do that very often. She was used in Korea to do shore bombardment, naval gunfire support, and that was her primary mission in the 80s. And so there were modifications done because the mission changed. Well, our mission has changed now, and going back to that veterans, if we don't provide accessibility, which by definition requires modifications to the vessel, we can't serve the veterans that literally served on board here. They can't come back and visit the ship unless we make it more accessible. I mean, I hate to say it, but we're getting old.
It's important. So what we try to do is do it in a thoughtful way to make it look right. We want it to look like it should have been there if it was there. And if we do, as we say, and I hate the term, actually gut a space or really remove most of the berthing or the bunks or the lockers, which we've done on portions of second deck, we still want to keep the rest of the ship feel around it. And that's part of the ethos that we relayed to Applied Minds.
Yeah, I love that in Lost at Sea, how it looks, you look like you're underwater in some places, but you also look like you're in
a ship. And that was very intentional. It was very deliberate on our part to do that. We don't want to... We don't truly gut a space. We remove what we don't need or what we need space for, largely the bunks and the lockers. And sometimes we make some modifications to doors. Just as a quick technical aside, we want to maintain a combination of fire barriers and also some watertight integrity. We are a vessel floating. We are not just encased in concrete or sitting on the dock somewhere. We are an actual vessel in the main channel of a major harbor. So I want to maintain some of that integrity as well.
And that's been in the news a lot lately. Yeah. We do want to make sure that we maintain it as we maintain our hull integrity. And also, the fabric of the ship, the fabric does not change, right? We are on a ship. If you change it so that it doesn't feel like you're on a ship, you've done something wrong. We're supposed to be representing all ships now. And it's kind of interesting. My brother came down early on when we were in Richmond and gave us a hand with the Dimension 2000 system which we are still trying to bring online, by the way, 10 years later. But
what is that?
It's the interior telephone system for the ship.
Oh.
And so,
Cool.
and it's what he did when he was on active duty on another ship. And he just kind of made the offhand comment, I'll come down and help you work on your ship because I can't go work on mine. His has been scrapped. Both of his have been scrapped. And so I thought to myself, as we make this transition to National Museum, it does provide a place that is not just my ship. It's representative of everybody's ship. It's my dad, it's my brother, it's myself, it's my kids. And the whole family kind of is in.
Because there is that thing too, like, I'm a wooden boat sailor, but I still feel very much at home here because it's a shipboard environment. So there's definite, translation across a lot of different types of vessels.
Yeah, we're very cautious too. We can, David and I and a few other people can walk through the ship and say, World War II, Korean modification, 1980s, World War II. There's so much fabric from all 3 eras. And I love the comment you made earlier too. People think we should return it back to World War II. And by the way, there's even been board interest for other companies or organizations to modify certain aspects of their ship back to World War II config. And it is disrespectful because in many ways to the history of the ship. And so these ships, the Iowas, we have at least 3 of the Iowas have 3 eras to address or to reflect. The New Jersey having a 4th with Vietnam with its 1-year deployment there. So it really they span such a long time frame in the Navy history. They're in the world of the Navy nominally 50 years and an active duty of 19 years or so, thereabouts. And so there's a lot more history there, and you have to respect all of it.
It's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that's kind of neat being a veteran, when I first went to one of the very first reunions, I sat down and chatted with somebody, just randomly sat at a table, and by luck of the draw, ended up sitting next to somebody who had worked on the exact same pieces of equipment that I had run, a decade or so before I was born, which was
cool.
interesting.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's fun. It's something, the ethos we have about this is something we've never really shared or perhaps even had the opportunity to. We talk about it at times. We've never documented it in any particular way. But, I think that there's kind of an opportunity to do that here. And in fact, I had to write a fairly long email just to Applied Minds to kind of describe that ethos and that culture and what we try to do and what we try to preserve.
So one of the things I'm working on internally, we're redoing our onboarding process for both volunteers and staff. And as part of that, sort of codifying what is our culture.
Yeah.
And the ethos, our preservation ethos, how we feel about the ship is certainly part of that. Part of it is we like to have fun. We like to tease people about, cats, for instance, Kyle. Kyle may get a new name here. He might not be
maybe.
Captain Roundup anymore.
Cat herder.
No, all these animals, I've changed my
Dr.
outlook on how to
Doolittle?
care for my yard.
Oh,
Yeah.
Dr. Doolittle speaks to me a lot. Anyway, that's a subject for maybe another podcast. We might do a whole one on Kyle's cats.
Yeah.
But we like to have fun. We like to be real. We like to be genuine. We're talking about topics that we do on the podcast. And we love to have guests in here. We want to be inspirational. We want to have people that come in that really drive a poignant point home. And obviously we want our listeners to enjoy listening. We also just want to be real. We want to be ourselves and let people know kind of who we are.
I was going to say, I think that part of the special piece of what we have with the team itself is that everybody is so diverse in what they bring to the organization, from their life background to their skill sets to their outlook on where we are going and what maybe we should be doing more to engage or whatever it may be. You come here and there's something for everyone because there is the representation of everyone's of input. I think nobody comes here with an idea and is shot down. Everybody's heard and implemented or they work together to make that idea better and work for us. But it's really a special environment where you have just this extremely diverse group of people that create this atmosphere of anybody who's coming from the historical standpoint to the education, to veterans, to community, to the hands-on kind of work that goes on. I think that everybody is different, and that makes it a special place and a place for everyone because of that.
And there is no lack of passion here.
By the way, just reflecting on something that you kind of touched on a little bit, but it's a little side trip too, is, we think of ourselves as a museum, but really we're this multifaceted organization, part attraction, part community asset, part museum, part artifact, and everything else. And you have to have a broader view. You can't just be, and forgive the ding perhaps, but you can't just be a purely museum person here. You have to be able to embrace all of it. I had somebody email me this week about, some of the folks out there in the pure museum world are looking to only preserve just what they have. Here, we're trying to make an impact in our community while preserving as much as we can. There's a different balance there.
It really is, and it's actually kind of a tough balance. I was talking to one of our security volunteers, who's a retired chief petty officer, and he's a museum junkie. I'm kind of a museum junkie, and pardon me, he was talking about the Air Force Museum keeps dinging him for money, and he's like, I don't want to give you money for an experience. I want you to restore the airplane that's back behind the hangar. That's what I want to see. And I chatted with him for a while, and I said, yeah, but you and I are kind of a dying breed. I mean, people do want the experience in addition to the artifact. And you can go too far one side or the other.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think people are real interested in going to old buildings and looking at junk under glass necessarily. But at the same time, if you go to a museum, an artifact or two is kind of important. And obviously the ship is artifact number one. And so, as we deal with Applied Minds and the design, not only talking about the ethos of preservation on the ship, but we're trying to strike that balance between being relevant, being current, telling the story of not just our story, but the future story of the Navy, the past story of the Navy, and still being able to address the desire of people to come out and see a legit, real piece of history that they can, if not handle, at least put their eyes on.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I love about our new mothball tour, is because it's not just going into a space and talking about it. You're actually going in there to sort of do something, and you get to explore.
You're experiencing it.
Yeah, you get to explore a little bit, and you're not told where to go. So that's a kind of another wrinkle that we're adding.
It's got an escape room feel. You're actually trying to solve a puzzle or problem, which is literally what we did and this is kind of a plug for a fun tour, but that's literally what we did up in Sassoon Bay for 6 weeks, getting the ship ready for tow.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about, is that the difference in the experience that we're trying to create.
Right. It's not just, hey, tell you where to go, but this is part of how we lived it.
And
Yep.
it lets you get to know the ship in a different way, too. You kind of, for lack of a better phrase, you bond with the ship a little bit.
Which, you know, again, comes back to what we're talking about here. What are we trying to do? Who are we? And why do we do what we do? You mentioned there's a lot of passion here, and there's a lot. I mean, it's a big scope, you know,
Yeah.
to do the community outreach, to do the preservation, to do the experiential, to do the attraction, to properly maintain and preserve the museum artifacts, to have a veterans outreach program, to educate children. That is a huge, huge scope. But you know, I'm thinking we're hitting it.
Yeah.
Cool.
And on that note,
Right.
Next time we're going to bring back the answer to the etymology question.
We
Yeah.
will. We will absolutely.
I
We're-
feel like it goes back to tall ships too. To
I-
square
I'm
riggers.
thinking
I
it
think
does, too.
I just think you're biased on tall ships.
I'm totally biased, but
Yeah,
yeah.
well, you know. Also, we'll be doing an episode coming up exclusively on the Mothball Tour. We want to wait until the boss is back, since
Yeah.
he was a big mover and shaker up in Richmond, and his opinion will be valuable. Once again, if you have input on the podcast, if you want to give us a topic or throw rocks at us, whatever, send us an email, podcast,
throw rocks at him.
POD, right, yeah,
Virtual rocks.
virtual rocks, podcast, PODCAST, podcast at labattleship.com, or as I'm fond of saying, labattleship.com.
Very French.
Yes, indeed. Send us that email. Let us know what you want to hear. Thanks for listening. We do appreciate our audience very much. And tune in next time for another exciting episode of Scuttlebutt.